You can pray until you faint. But if you don't try to get up and do something, God's not going to put it in your lap. It ain't no need in saying that I'm not going to get in the mess. Because if you were born in America with a black face, honey, you were born in the mess. Those are the words of a legendary civil rights activist, Fannie Lou Hamer, from Indianola, Mississippi. My name is Milton Dockery. I'm a native of Laurinburg, North Carolina, and I'm the chairman of the Department of History at MATC. I want to thank the Racine Public Library and also the Racine Heritage Museum for inviting me here tonight to talk about Freedom Summer. If you have not had an opportunity to take a look at this magnificent display, I would suggest that you do. And just like I thought, I didn't put any pictures or things of that sort in this presentation because this display can stand alone in itself. So my purpose tonight is to talk about the causes, the results, and some of the judicial emasculation, or the tearing down of many of the gains that were made as a result of Freedom Summer 1964. And what I want to do is, I'm not going to go into a long, drawn-out thing, because what I'm doing for you tonight, I take 3 weeks to do at MATC in Contemporary Civil Rights. So I'm really compressing this until right at an hour. I have about 16 slides, I think, but some of them I may not be as detailed on, but you will get the crux of the information needed. But once again, I want to thank you for coming out and joining us tonight. I tell my students all the time, you know, if J-Lo or Beyonce was present, we have a full house. But oftentimes when you're sharing knowledge and information that people can use, it's hard to get people to come out. But that's all right, because where there are small numbers, you can work wonders, just as these young people did in Freedom Summer 1964. I'm not the most tech-savvy person in the world, but I will do my best to, as I proceed through this. A little background information. I want to start with the founding of SNEEK, because SNEEK plays a very valuable role in this whole entire process. And SNEEK stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they met at Shaw University in early 1960 at the suggestion of Ella Baker. Ella Baker is what I call one of those old warriors. She was a graduate of Shaw University, historically black college in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I was fortunate enough to teach there for 2 years. Extremely intelligent young woman, valedictorian of her class, deeply involved in the civil rights movement, deeply involved in advising people for change. And so at her urging, since she had worked very closely with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. Martin Luther King and others, she noticed that they did not have a lot of young people involved. And Ella knew the importance of the involvement of young people. So she invites them to Raleigh, North Carolina to sit down and talk about their role in the civil rights movement. And not only that, trying to come up with an organization for these young people. Quite a few people were there. Dave Dennis was there. Dave Dennis is the young man that eulogized Mr. Chaney, one of the 3 civil rights workers. The former mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry. Many of you may remember Marion Barry from the 90s and some of the problems that he had. Marion Barry was there. Matter of fact, Barry was very active in Freedom Summer. And so they gathered at Shaw University. And by the way, it's one of those Freedmen Bureau schools that come on the heels of the American Civil War during the Reconstruction period. And so she invites all these student leaders in, and they found SNEEK. But here is something I want you to remember when you think about SNEEK. And this just goes to show Ella's genius. I'm sorry, I have a tendency to walk a little bit. I'm trying to stay still. But she warned the students to keep their efforts or keep control of their movement. She realized that a lot of older people had a tendency to think that young people did not know a great deal. I'm an advisor for student organizations on campus, and some of my fellow advisors, I tell them, these young people are here, they know what they're doing. Our job is to advise. And if they're trying to do something wrong and that we don't think is right, and we tell them and they disagree, they learn by trial and error. So that's the importance of SNEEK, giving those young people a voice, giving those young people a role within the movement that they control. And I think that's real central to that. Now, under this, I also have something called the role of Council of Federated Organizations. It's called COFO. COFO was established in 1962 at the urging of Robert Kennedy. It was the umbrella organization to bring all of those involved in the civil rights movement, or organizations involved in the civil rights movement, under one umbrella so they could share funds. If you look at the literature and read a little more, what you will find is there was tremendous competition for funds, but there was only a limited number of funds to go around. So that's the brilliance of COFO, bringing all those organizations together. And once again, what I'm doing is just like I do in my class. I have a tendency to walk a little bit, but I have to realize this is being recorded. So let's get into some of the causes. But the purpose of the 1964 Freedom Summer Project was to design to draw the nation's attention to the nonviolent oppression experienced by Mississippi blacks who attempted to exercise their constitutional rights and develop a grassroots freedom movement that could be sustained long after student activists left. Let me stress something here. That's the beauty of SNEEK. That's the difference between SNEEK and many of your older civil rights organizations. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the NAACP. Oftentimes they would come into an area, take a leadership role, and when they left, Dave, there would be nobody there to continue that. So what you see with SNEEK is, SNEEK was very careful to train young leaders locally so when they left, the movement could continue. And so I think that's a brilliant strategy on their behalf. Also, just some data information. According to the census of 1960, African Americans were 45% of the Mississippi population, but less than 6.7% were registered to vote. 6.7%. Less than 6.7% registered to vote. Give you a couple examples. I know you may not be able to see this. In Clarksdale, Mississippi, and there's a slight typo, there were 14,004 African Americans eligible to vote. Out of 14,000, only 1,061 were registered. In Holly Springs, Mississippi, 7,168 eligible, only 57 were registered. Now, if you walk down the display, you can see additional data for most of the counties in Mississippi. And many of the counties in Mississippi had no blacks registered to vote at all. And so, as you can see, the political process is extremely important. You may wonder, why did they not want these folks to vote? Power. Political power. Many in the power structure, and I want to stress many, I didn't say all, many knew that if African Americans in certain places in Mississippi, some of these counties, had the right to vote, they would rule that county politically. And that's the key to understanding that. And many would take the most extreme measures to keep individuals from voting. It's amazing when I talk to young people, sometimes they take voting for granted. But then when they begin to learn how people died and lost their lives and people were executed, like the 3 civil rights workers, it dawns upon them the importance of voting. And as I stated, to move forward, other counties in the state had no African Americans. Some counties in the state, had no African American registered voters at all. African Americans, and just to continue along that line in terms of some of the things that are going on, African Americans were also denied a quality education. However, education was needed to vote. Let me say that again, denied a quality education. One of the qualifications to vote is to be able to fill out registration forms and interpret any section of the Mississippi Constitution that one of the 81 registrars throughout Mississippi wanted you to interpret. Let's just be blunt here. Let's just be frank speaking here. That's hypocrisy at its best. You deny someone education, or quality education, and then you deny them the right to vote. Not only the right to vote, and I'll talk about this a little more a little later. They pay taxes. When I say the African American pay taxes, but yet still couldn't go to the public library. Imagine being in Racine, Wisconsin, with all of this wealth of information in this library, and we deny people, based on the color of their skin, the right to come to the library. Knowledge is power. I think it's George Cotton, back during the Revolutionary period, a Presbyterian minister said that knowledge is power. And knowledge is something that no one can ever take that away from you. It's something you take to the grave with you. And just to move forward, I can be a little talkative because I eat, breathe, and sleep history, and I got to remember I have to keep moving on. Also, another issue, they face extreme terrorist violence for the most minor infractions, let alone attempting to register to vote. I tell my students all the time, some of the men that suffered some of the greatest pain that are still around are elderly black men that went through this era. Got a PhD in somebody calling you boy. You're walking down the sidewalk and you were expected to kind of step off to the side so white individuals could pass. If you didn't step off to the side, it was custom to tip your hat. That was Mississippi customs. And if you stepped outside of those customs, you were in ultimate danger. Ultimate danger. So what we're talking about here also is courage. Because it took a lot of courage for these individuals to stand up and face the system. Another thing that was happening in Mississippi is that its 5 members of the congressional delegation, along with its senators, Senator Easterlin and Stennis, were re-elected year after year, and therefore they gained seniority, and they strategically had themselves placed on various committees. So if legislation was introduced, that legislation had to do what? Come through their committee. And as a result of that, they were able to shut down a lot of stuff designed to promote change. Most African Americans also, once you get into some of these causes, most African Americans also worked for whites and were fired for attempting to register to vote. Started my presentation off with a comment from Fannie Lou Hamer. When Fannie Lou Hamer went down in Indianola to the Indianola, Mississippi courthouse to attempt to register to vote, she worked on a plantation as a sharecropper with her family. Fannie had a good job too. Dave, she was a timekeeper. And back during that time frame, the timekeeper, you was hot stuff. If you were the timekeeper or drove a tractor or something like that in some of these areas, you were big time. The plantation owner came to Fannie and said, Fannie, either you go and withdraw your voter registration or you got to leave here. Fannie left that night. And I'm talking about a woman that's not the most educated woman in the world, because on average, African Americans in 1964 in Mississippi had a 6th grade education, or at a 6th grade education level. And you must understand, during planting time and harvest time, they won't go in, children won't go into school. You had to go work in the fields to get those crops planted, and then during harvest time, had to work, get them harvested. And as a result of that, many were out of school. They went to segregated school. And even though they went to segregated schools, these teachers, many of them were PhDs because they couldn't get a job nowhere else, made sure that these kids learned. I want to get a little personal here. My father only has a 4th grade education, but can help my nieces and nephews with algebra. And here I am, a very educated man, and I struggle tremendously with math. But But the point I'm making is the quality of education he received during his era thoroughly prepared him. He ran a business for over 40 years, extremely successful. Let me move forward. I mentioned the literacy test was applied, interpreting certain sections of the Constitution. And if I didn't say this, I want to say this now. Many of those 81 registers throughout Mississippi, many of them couldn't halfway read or write. So you get a black person, got a PhD, come in there and they can fill out the questionnaire and they can interpret. Well, you're a smart one. We'll give it to you in a foreign language. Believe you me, it was up to the registrar to determine who was eligible to vote. Now, let's flip the script. Many whites came in and literally couldn't read and write, boom, passed them right through. African-Americans' rights to free speech were being denied as well. Something as simply as protesting, a silent protest, standing with signs. Police would come up and arrest people and brutalize them. You may say, some may say, well, you know that there's always the court system. Well, sure, but in Mississippi things were different. And I'm not talking about all elected officials, and I'm not talking about all judges. And here's something else I shall say. Many of those judges that made rulings against those in the civil rights movement, not just in Mississippi, were Kennedy appointees. Let me say that again. Many of those judges, federal judges, that made rulings against those in the movement were Kennedy appointees. And Kennedy was a very astute man. He needed that Southern vote in order to win. So oftentimes the rights of blacks in Mississippi or blacks in general in the South, and we got to talk about the North too, was nothing more than a political football designed to move people forward. There was also inaction by the federal government. And what I mean when I say inaction by the federal government, knowing what was happening to people, didn't do anything. For example, in 1957, during Eisenhower's administration, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 that allowed the Attorney General to seek an injunction on any state, city, or local municipality that infringed upon a person's right to vote. No one never enforced the law, including Robert Kennedy. Not only that, the point I'm making by sharing what I just shared with you is this. Mississippi was a closed society, folks. A closed society. Matter of fact, I didn't say this when I first started heading to my presentation. Mississippi called these students coming into Mississippi in summer '64, they called it an invasion. An invasion. Police force went out and bought additional rifles. In Jackson, they bought an armored truck. It's called a Thompson. It was named Thompson after the mayor, Mayor Thompson in Jackson. So this was serious, real serious, and you'll see just how serious momentarily. How does SNEEK end up in Mississippi? How? As you move through the display, you can't see him from here. There was an elderly gentleman named Amazing Moore. Met a young man by the name of Robert Moses, who goes by Bob. Amazing was a member of the NAACP, the local chapter, and was a high official in that local chapter. And Amazing knew that there were certain things he could do and could not do as an NAACP representative. So he had to be careful to follow the national platform, Sure, you have local chapters, but that national organization is the one that determines policy and determines the direction that organization is going to go in. So Mr. Moore knew that voter registration, dealing with education, trying to break down segregation, he would run into problems at with the national office. And guess who he turns to? Young Bob Moses. Bob Moses goes down and meet him. He shares information with him. This is around 1961. And Bob Moses went all over Mississippi in 61 by himself, investigating and talking to people about what was occurring in Mississippi. And as a result of that, that's how SNEEK gets involved. And then you add COFO to it, and you get all the other organizations that are under that umbrella. By 63, very little progress is being made in terms of getting people to register to vote. So what do? They hold mock elections. Mock elections. And the purpose of that mock election was to educate people, many who had never been involved in the political process, to educate them on the process. They ran a slate of candidates, a very diverse group of candidates. And people showed up. I think about 93,000 people totally throughout voted. Now remember, it was a mock election. And this mock election really revealed a great deal, because this is where we see the founding of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which I'll talk about a little more later. There's something else they did that was brilliant. Had a lot of illiterate people in Mississippi. I'm talking black and white. So when you were involved in this mock election and you couldn't read or write, and there was a slate of candidates, what they did, they put a Black Panther on the ballot beside certain names. So if you were illiterate, you saw that Panther. Now remember, we're talking a mock election. You know who to vote for. You know who to vote for. So 63 is critical, but Bob Moses gets it all started as early as 61 in terms of getting this ball rolling that would eventually become Freedom Summer 64. Now listen, by 64, SNEEK, CORE, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, NAACP. Matter of fact, let me backtrack. In late 63, they began to meet and plot and plan about Freedom Summer. The issue before them was simple. Should we bring white kids, upwards of 1,000, down into Mississippi? And let me tell you, let me just share this and you'll see more in a minute. They had a debate about bringing white students in. Now let me tell you the purpose of this first. They watched what happened in Selma, Alabama on Freedom Day in 63. They noticed that many whites in Selma, including ministers, came out to support Freedom Day. And what they noticed in Selma, the police was there for protection. The FBI had agents present. The Department of Justice was there. In essence, as long as whites were involved, very little violence. Or if it was violence, controlled violence. So during the debate in terms of bringing down white students, Selma was used. Now, some said no. We don't want white kids. Here's the reason why. Many African Americans in Mississippi, especially the older ones, were not used to dealing with whites at that level. They were used to working for them. Used to saying yes sir, no sir, and bowing. But as far as meeting a person on their own level, they weren't used to that. And many individuals felt that if whites came down, many African Americans would not be as honest and as open about what was occurring. On the flip side, you had some like Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie said, I'm glad to see more people come down here and join this fight. But here's the crux of why. Many people felt that if those white kids came down, the federal government would be involved. And it would bring the weight of the federal government down on Mississippi. I'll push that issue, I'll talk about that issue a little more. And by the way, 90% of those that are going to come are mainly from the North, Midwest, and the West Coast. Look, folks, talking about some of the best and brightest white kids coming down. Not only white kids, they were Latino. Here's something that some of you may know and some of you may not know. The involvement of the Jewish community. See, a lot of people don't realize that the Jewish struggle, the African American struggle, have been linked for many years. Why? Because their struggle has been very similar. And as a result of that, many Jewish people didn't even hesitate to step up to the plate. So that's critical in terms of talking about this whole ordeal. Now, many of the things I just mentioned is in this next slide, and that would allow me to journey on. And finally, just to close that note about the debate on the white kids, COFO had its final meeting in January 1964, and it was decided they would bring in the white kids in terms of getting them down into Mississippi. And let me tell you, that changed the movement a great deal. Now, if you were a student coming down to Mississippi, you just didn't show up. You had to write a letter of interest. You were screened. You had to agree to training. Most importantly, you had to agree with African Americans being in a leadership role. And that's just the script was kind of flipped a little bit, if you will. Many whites were used to, being in charge. But now when you get down to Mississippi, the African Americans are in charge. And in many ways, that's wise, because many of these kids coming from the Midwest, and they were middle class and upper class kids, they did not have a clue what they were stepping into. I mean, not a clue. So guess what? They underwent an extensive training program at Wesleyan College in Ohio, which used to be a college for women. It's now part of Miami University, where I attended. Not only that, Berea College in Kentucky, a liberal arts college that had been educating African Americans, even before the Civil War, agreed to host some of the training sessions, but due to political pressure, they pulled out. And it was at Miami where all of this training went on. For an example, they teach you the do's and don'ts about Mississippi. Don't get caught away from place at night. Remember now, these white kids are going to be staying in black homes. If you come in, try to come in and go around the back so nobody won't see you. When you get out the car, at night, the interior light, make sure the interior light is on. Make sure you know all the road system in Mississippi, the area that you're going to be in. They taught them things like that, but they also taught them tactics of survival. What are you going to do when you see a police dog coming at you and foam is running out of their mouth? What are you going to do when you got a police officer who is battering you with his billy club? It's amazing what they did. They taught them, Reverend, how to get into the fetal position. Now the fetal looks in the womb, like that. Well, if you're balled up like that, it protects your front portion and most of your organs. But Dave, it doesn't protect those kidneys. As a football player, the worst hit I ever took was a kidney shot. Somebody speared me in my kidneys. And I'm gonna be honest, I thought I was tough, but I cried like a baby. Got teased for it, but hey. You know, so learning those tactics. Let me tell y'all something. When they were doing this training, sometimes they got a little rough. You know, in terms of calling names and go, if you get a chance, go to YouTube and look at Eyes on the Prize and look at some of that raw footage. And you see individuals get up to them, oh, y'all got a little rough there. I thought you were gonna hurt me. But it was real. And usually, I hate to switch to a military ideology here or interpretation, but when you're trained and you do something over and over again in a time of crisis, you don't think about it. It kicks in. It kicks in. Here's something else. I think I said this, but I'll say it again. The average age of these kids, 21. 21. Here's something else that's interesting. Over 150 lawyers came down and participated in the training. Over 300 law students came down and participated in the training. Why? They were going to need legal representation. They knew that before they arrived. Not only that, I mentioned the aspect of African-American, agreeing to African-American legal. But not only that, they showed films on what to expect. They showed this film on one of the registrars. Big old burly guy. I know he had to weigh close to 500 pounds. And when they showed the video, many of the white kids started laughing at this guy because they looked at him like, are you serious, him? And those many African Americans got real upset because they were telling him, you just don't know what you're up against when you arrive in Mississippi. And as a result of that, they gave them the opportunity to leave. Remember, we're talking June 64. In the middle of that training, word had came to Ohio about church burnings. Warner, Chaney, and Goodman went down early. Matter of fact, about 3 years early. After they finished investigating this church burning, they were arrested by the sheriff, Cecil Price. They had been taught in that training, and whenever you're arrested, call the SNEEK office. They were denied the right to make that phone call. Price, after these kids were arrested, called up his Klan brethren. Yes, he was a member of the Klan. And once they hatched that plan, Price talked with one of his sheriffs, Sheriff Rainey, told him when to let these kids go. When they let these kids go, they were given specific instructions on what direction to go. In essence, he sent them directly into the trap that was made. Pulled them over. I think Warner was driving. Just shot him point blank. Pow! Man, you know, the sheriff coming up to the car and then he just, boom, shoot you in your head. Your passenger and Chaney's in the back seat and he see this. Goodman was next. Shot Chaney. Chaney tried to run. Shot him down. Beat him unmercifully. I'm in the library. I can't teach like I do in my class, Reverend, because I don't believe that you can teach history. It's too much political correctness. We historians operate on a term called the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. I tell my students all the time, Get your mind out of the 21st century and come back and come with me to the 20th century. See, because if you're thinking a 21st century context, you miss this. But if you think in a 20th century context, you grasp it. I tell my students, I can think like a Klansman. Why? I can go back to the 20th century. These kids, brutalized, murdered, and buried in the earthen dam on a farm. Just like COFO members and, the organizations under COFO had thought. Something happened to these white kids, federal government would be involved. Didn't even take a full day. The FBI was there. Department of Justice was there. They brought in sailors to search and drag the lakes looking for these. Imagine how their parents felt knowing that their kids were missing. Let me tell y'all something, I'm a mama's boy too. I am a big time mama's boy. And I can't imagine what my mom would go through if something like that happened to me. So it confirmed it. Or let me just put it another way. It sent a signal that a white life was more valuable than a black life. Listen to this. Dave, I know you know about this. Ever so often the Corps of Engineers would take and do what they call drudge legs. They did it out here a little while ago. And in Mississippi, when they were looking for these kids, they would have these boats and they would drop these like hooks down in the water. It was like a big old rake. And it would search the bottom. What you think they found? Human remains of other people missing. And they were reported, but nothing was done. And they finally received a break and learned that these kids were buried in that earthen dam. I mentioned the Eyes on the Prize series of Freedom Summer 1964. If you haven't seen it, go to YouTube and take a look. He's helping unload the bodies at the hospital. The sheriff. Now that Chaney and Swan are all there, they put together Freedom Summer. But the major issue was simple. Money. How you going to finance all of this? Just can't roll down to Mississippi, start doing things without money. By May, before June got going, you only had $10,000 had been raised. The comedian, African-American comedian, Dick Gregory, who has a rich civil rights tradition, or history, shall I say. He fundraised and raised over $97,000 himself. So this movement operated on a shoestring budget. Listen to this one. They couldn't even afford to pay their paid staff their $10 a week salary. The toilet got clogged at the COFO office in Macomb, Mississippi. They didn't even have $5, Dave, to get it unclogged. But they were there for a purpose, a major purpose. Let me tell you something, as I said, they didn't have much money, but the state was thoroughly prepared. I'm going to pick up my pace a little bit because I don't want to worry you long. There are several phases of this movement. Several phases. And as you walk through the display, you will actually see the phases. voter registration. Major phase. There were two kinds of voter registration. You had the regular registration. Then you had those that had to register to get involved in the mock election for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The purpose of registration for with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and their mock elections was really to get you prepared when you went downtown to register to vote. So you get a little practice there. You know, so when you get down there, you know exactly what to do and you know what to expect. The next phase. Building the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is a phase of the movement. They just didn't start with this. Matter of fact, by building the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, as I was saying, what you do to get people used to being involved in the political process. Here are some of the things they did. This required learning and teaching the rules and procedures of electoral parties, and then organizing precincts, county, district, and state level Mississippi bodies to strict ordinances with official rules of the National Democratic Party. So in essence, what we see happening here is they're preparing people for the political process. You just don't throw people out there in the field and expect them to be able to do. You got to get some training in. And this was the beauty of the whole entire movement. And what you see a little later in November 64, I think it's August 64, no, November 64, they actually challenged the all-white delegation from Mississippi. I'll talk about that in a moment. And once I'm journeying along pretty fast here, but I think you're getting the crux of what I'm trying to say. The next phase, freedom schools. These kids were spread throughout the state. And everywhere that you had students with freedom summer in a particular area, they developed freedom schools. What did they teach at these freedom schools? African-American history, math, with the exception of the African-American aspect, basically the same thing that was being taught in regular school. Basically the same thing that was being taught in regular school. And here's the beauty. You know, this was designed for children, but yet there were adults coming to these classes sitting right beside the children. Why? Because they had a thirst for knowledge. Every school had a library. You couldn't, as I said earlier, you couldn't go to the public library. So the beauty of it, you're exposing kids to new things. You're changing the thought process. You want to get more involved in the political process. But if you weren't exposed to that, you don't know. I like to use food as an analogy. It depends on how you were raised and what you ate when you were young in terms of what you like. And it's difficult sometimes to step outside the box. That's one of the things that my wife has a tendency to say to me. She will tell you, I'm a picky eater. But see, if I'm exposed to more, like these students were exposed to different information in these books, you open up to more. So that's just what it did. It opened up the world to them. They built community centers. I don't know how many community centers we got here in the city of Racine that comes out of the 1960s movement here. And for many kids in this city, those centers give them activities to do in the afternoon. Because my mom used to tell us, well, when you idle, trouble's waiting if you're not careful. So community centers. Not only community centers, there were political organizations, there were educated. Let me just say this. At these community centers, they provided cultural and educational programs. They included political organization, adult literacy courses, staffed by citizenship school teachers. They had health programs to educate people and give people physicals by doctors and nurses. And that's just a whole nother phase of the movement. coming down to help out these people. Some of these people had never been to a doctor a day in their life. Most of the time, and in most black communities in Mississippi and the rural, and by the way, I'm from North Carolina, the rural areas of North Carolina, those kids were birthed by what they call a midwife, I think it is. And she would go downtown and record their birth at the county office. I think today they probably will be called a physician assistant. They're good enough. But think about it. And some of these women were not educated people. Not only did they deliver black babies, they deliver white babies too. It was nothing for many white mothers, for the wife, go get Miss so-and-so and so and tell her, my wife, the baby's coming. So they had that. They have vocational training centers, teaching people a skill. Here's the reason why that's important. And I'll mention now, the White Citizens Council began to urge farmers to mechanize before the black community in Mississippi gained political power. So if you win the registered vote, as I said earlier, kick you off the plantation. What better way to solve this economic problem than to mechanize? So, you know, they can protest all they want. They're not on the plantation. They're not affecting the harvest or the planting of the crops. Wow, we have machines that can do that. So that's really important too. And as I said, there were libraries in all of these centers, and many northern, midwestern, West Coast sympathizers sent books, and that's why they were able to have these libraries in these centers, which is very, very important. There's extreme violence. I'm talking about violence in the most extreme form. You may not be able to see this, but this is just a few examples of some of the violence. Walk down the display, there's quite a few, matter of fact, where I'm standing right here, there's a list of individuals killed in the movement. You go down a little further, you will see some of the violent attacks. I'll give you a few of them. June 6th, Moss Point, Mississippi. Lawrence Guyette addressing a voting registration rally. Shot, a Klansman shot into the crowd, seriously wounded a woman. Listen to this one. Then when 3 blacks ran the man down and held the attacker, they got arrested. Klansman attacked Rabbi Arthur Leopold with steel pipes. I think there's a picture of him on the display. And he and 2 other summer volunteers were hospitalized with injuries. Some examples of police action. July the 8th, Hattiesburg, Reverend Robert Breach of National Council of Churches listen to this one, was arrested on felony charges because his checking account was briefly overdrawn. Boy, if that policy was in place, a whole lot of people would be felons. That's especially if you're not into balance and checkbook, all that kind of stuff. No, you got to pay attention to the numbers. But a felony, because you overdrew your bank account. But then too, along with this mass violence, there were other forms of retaliation. In Greenwood and several other counties, they had federally funded food programs for the poor. And as I said earlier, there are a lot of poor whites in Mississippi too. A lot. They cut those programs off to punish people for trying to register to vote. It was a brutal winter that winter, Reverend, and a lot of people were facing starvation. Young men like Ivanhoe Donaldson and others got in their truck and they drove as far as the Midwest, Michigan and other areas and brought back truckloads of food to the warehouse so they could feed people during this harsh winter. They brought back medical supplies and all of that. Soon as they got to the Mississippi County line, they were arrested for transporting narcotics across state lines. Those narcotics were aspirins. Another way they retaliated in terms of this violence. This wasn't violent, but yet still there's another way that fits that category. A group went down to the courthouse, 18, matter of fact, Fannie Lou Hamer was one of them, went down to the Indiana courthouse to register to vote. They took a bus, and on the way back, they were pulled over. Guess what the charge was? The bus was too orange. You know, buses used to be orange before they switched over to yellow. You're laughing, do you see how? You see what they were up against? To wind this down, so I can stay within my time frame. There's a lot more I can say, a lot more I want to say, but I need to move forward so I can close out. As I was saying earlier, and I'm still on the violence column, COFO and SNEEK and the organizations assumed that they brought white kids down, bring the federal government also, and I think I failed to mention this, but it also bring media attention. Media, the news media. It did. But the news media wasn't interested in what happened to black folk. They were following the white kids around. For the most part. And the same thing with the federal government. And while all of this is going on in the middle of all this heat, in the middle of what's happening in Mississippi, I think it's July 2nd, 64, LBJ signed the the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And ladies, within that act is something called Title VII. Are you familiar with it? Take a look at it. And that was a last minute thing, trying to hold up the law from passing. And what we see happen once that law was passed, things began to change in Mississippi. But they changed slowly. For the sake of time, let me bring this to a close. What were the results of Freedom Summer? It created local leaders to continue the struggle once Freedom Summer was over. Remember earlier I talked about the beauty of SNEEK, training local leaders. It removed some of the fear from locals, removed the fear locals had of getting, not all, but most locals had, of getting involved in the political process for change. It gave blacks in Mississippi and in the United States in general hope for positive change through nonviolent direct action. I think another key factor, it played a role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act of 1965, 1 year later, and forced the federal government to protect all of its citizens. And it gave the movement more media coverage. Listen to this, even internationally. If you go back to the 50s and look at the movement, Emmett Till, Brown versus Board of Education, the McGovern bus boycott, and look at the coverage in the media worldwide, the communists really used that to their advantage. In essence, how can they tell us that we're not democratic and we're not doing this and that, or doing right by our people and our controlled areas or our spheres of influence, but look at what they're doing in America. The Soviet Union had a very famous photograph that they ran, especially, and I'm going back a little bit, during, I think it's the Brown versus Board of Education, where they got a police officer, he's pointing his finger in a little child's face. So this movement was caught up in propaganda worldwide too, through the Soviet Union and other nations. And also the realization of voting did not become a reality, even though, let me change that, even though the Civil Rights Act of '64 was passed, the Voting Rights Act of '65 was passed, the voting in Mississippi really didn't become a reality until the 1970s, because even though these laws were on the book, the Mississippi legislature made sure to pass laws that infringed on those gains. So Freedom Summer, in terms of voting, the realization doesn't kick in until the 80s and the 90s, and even today, in which Mississippi has more black elected officials than any other state in the United States. So that fear that many whites had was justified. But what frightened many of them so much was the fact that they thought that once blacks or minorities got into political power, they would do to whites what they had done to blacks. And what you find is most black people are some of the most forgiving people on the face of the earth. Might talk a little loud at times, ain't gonna do nothing to you. You're laughing. I like that. See, history can be fun. A lot of fun when you have somebody that can deliver it properly. What about 50 years later? Let me tell y'all, there's a whole lot more I can say. Like I said, I do this in 3 weeks. I've made it in almost an hour. There's a whole lot more I want to say. But I want to be respectful of your time, because I am so honored to see all of you all out here tonight, because this is some good information. I want to commend you. I mean, this is amazing. Think about it. I've never seen a library do this. Not a public library. I know in my hometown they have storytelling, which is good. I take my nephew sometimes. This here, not just this type of history, but history in general is a powerful tool. I mean, an extremely powerful tool. 50 years later, what do we see happening in our society? 50 years later, after Freedom Summer, what do we see happening? Here are some of the things. The Civil Rights Act of '64, which gets rid of discrimination in public places and other things, is being challenged concerning serving citizens and some businesses. Some businesses don't want to serve certain people, primarily the LBGT community. And I'm not talking about what's right and what's wrong. We're talking about business here. The right to be served, the right to go in the store and buy what you want to buy. One U.S. senator, I won't call no name, but there's a great horse race that takes place in that state yearly. He said if I was around in '64, I would have voted against the bill. He also stated it should be up to the businesses who they want to serve or not. If you know, 50 years later, if you pay attention to the political process, many are calling for a return to state rights and are openly challenging federal authority. That's what Mississippi was doing, challenging federal authority. It's all right to peacefully assemble and peacefully protest. But federal law trumps state law at all times. That was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, bar none. Dave, that goes back to the days of the Marshall Court. John Marshall, first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. That's just how long that doctrine, I think it's called the doctrine of interposition, has been in place. Many believe that, once again, we're talking 50 years later, many believe that when minorities vote for certain candidates today, they are getting free stuff. You look, you don't vote for the man or woman because, you know, that's the candidate that best serves your interests. You vote because you're getting some free stuff, like food stamps. But there is also the attack on the Voting Rights Act. I'm talking about 50 years later now. Recent Supreme Court decision started the process of what lawyers and historians call judicial emasculation, to tear it down. Under the Voting Rights Act, many of those areas that had a history of interfering with voting rights, anytime they wanted to make changes to their voting laws, they had to go through the Department of Justice. They no longer have to do that. And the next day in my home state, they were pushing voter ID laws and all of that. Even though there's very little evidence of voter fraud. Even the conservative Raleigh News and Observer defunct that. But people are trudging ahead. Look, not all, but some are just like those in '64. They see the changing demographics of the country. '64 was a fantastic year, not only because of Freedom Summer, because I was born. I'll be celebrating my 50th birthday on it in November, and I've seen a lot of change. When I went to high school, Dave, I went to high school with African Americans, whites, and a few Native Americans. If you go to my high school, not the last time I was home, usually when I can get home early enough after school is done, I try to go and substitute at the high school, which is a lot of fun, but it looks like an international bazaar. People from all over the world. So the changing demographics are causing some people, remember what I said, some, and say all. You'll never want to condemn everybody for the actions of a few. Heard somebody say that. Well, I won't even say that. All of this is occurring when we see, as I said, a major shift in demographics. And let me say this. I want to close with this. Freedom Summer changed America. Not only did it change America, it made America conform to its principles found in the United States Constitution. It took a while, and that's the beauty of history. Things changed for the better. Not only did it change for the better, but it opened up this beautiful thing we call democracy. It made the realization of Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian democracy, and extending the right to vote without owning property to the common man. It made a reality of a Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton by granting women the right to vote. That's the beauty of America. And if we all work together, American exceptionalism will continue. But if we are divided, we can't continue to make the progress that we have seen in our nation's history. I know I've thrown a lot at you tonight. I did my best to keep it simple and covering a few years in a little over an hour. I want to thank you all so much, as I said earlier, for coming out. I want to thank Melissa from the library, Dr. Christopher Polson from the Racine Heritage Museum for inviting me. They have invited me on a few occasions. I think I've done about 3 presentations for them, and I'm so appreciative. I thank you all so much, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. And hopefully I've said something tonight that will pique someone's interest to continue to read and study history. Thank you all so much.